When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, when smouldering human remains are found in a field in Hertfordshire, it's a policeman's hunch and a diligent expert witness that helps catch the killers.
I've been to many scenes of crimes, and many of them have been in remote locations. And I've wished that the trees and the bushes surrounding the crime scene could speak to me. And on this occasion, they did.
And how forensic fibre analysis by an expert witness revealed evidence to prove who was really responsible for causing a fatal road crash.
On the brake pedal cover of the Frontera, we found a brown plastic coating mark, which matched the female occupant's boots.
By counting and identifying pollen grains, you're able to envisage a place. You can tell the police a lot about what's happened at a crime scene. And you can say, this person has contacted this kind of place. So you could say to me, I never went there. You give me your shoes and I can say, well, there's a high probability that you did.
June 1995, Hertfordshire. Police detective Paul Dockley is called to the Amwell Place farm. A worker has discovered a partially burnt body in a ditch.
The story was that a farmer and his cowhand had seen smoke coming up from the centre of the field and had gone across to investigate what the cause was. And when they get there, they see there's a body in the ditch.
The body had been set on fire sometime previously and was now smouldering.
In 1995, this was an arable field with maize in it. It's now a livestock field with cows. And this is the actual spot where the body was in the ditch. Now, obviously, this ditch has been freshly dug out, but there were bushes on either side. And the fire was down in the bottom of the ditch. I had no idea who this guy was. Nobody else did. This is almost like a jigsaw with a piece of blue sky. That's exactly what it's like. And so we were working with that piece of blue sky.
When a crime scene is outside like this one, it's at the mercy of the weather. Rainfall or winds could destroy valuable evidence. Paul knew he needed to act quickly.
I really was racking my brain to think, what could be the best evidence that I could extract in the 24 hours I've got? And when you consider the body was probably put there overnight, the previous night, so I'm already 12 hours into this investigation.
With the clock ticking, Paul had a radical idea.
There's a thing called traces, trace elements, and it's taught to us detectives that if you touch anything, you're likely to leave a trace element, either your clothing on something at the scene or something from the scene on your clothing. I'm a hay fever sufferer, and it was one of those pollen-laden days that us hay fever sufferers really dread. And I said to the scenes of crime sergeant, I want to take pollen samples.
Paul's hunch was that whoever left the body in the ditch must have come into contact with the unique variety of pollen nearby, and then carried that pollen from the scene stuck to their clothes, shoes or body. Paul hoped that matching pollen profiles could later prove a suspect was at the scene of the crime.
I do think there was some sort of trepidation because we've never done this before. I honestly didn't know what I was looking at, but I just thought, I've got one hit at this scene.
Investigators took samples of soil from around the body and from the entrance to the field, hoping they would be rich in telltale pollen. But to locate and identify the microscopic grains, they needed an expert.
The detective sergeant at scenes of crime actually contacted Kew Gardens to ask if they knew of somebody who could actually analyse pollen as we'd taken the samples. And they said they knew somebody who was an expert in pollen examination. And this was Professor Pat Wiltshire.
At that time, Patricia Wiltshire was a pollen expert who had spent her career gathering samples from archaeological digs.
I got a telephone call from the police one day, which changed my life, because they asked me to investigate a murder with them. I don't think I'd ever even spoken to a policeman before that. And he said, oh, you said you look at pollen. And I said, yes, I do. I didn't know what I was in for.
Patricia agreed Paul's hunch that pollen could provide evidence to place a suspect at the crime scene was a good one. The key was the unique qualities of the pollen.
First of all, it's tiny and you can't see it. Secondly, it will stick to things because it's a charged particle. So if you brush against it with your clothing, it'll wiggle down into the weave of your clothing. It will stick to your shoes. It will stick to your hair. So it's tiny, you can't see it, and you carry it around with you.
But Patricia wasn't convinced by the team's idea to gather pollen by collecting soil samples from the field.
It was an agricultural soil, and the farmer grew corn there. And to grow crops regularly in fields, you need fertiliser, and you need aeration. You need the soil to be turned over, to be ploughed. So there was oxygen in the soil and fertiliser in the soil. This is all marvellous for microbes to latch onto anything organic and decompose it. So any pollen or any plant remains or anything else that was in that soil would have been decomposed by the microbes. The samples didn't have pollen in them. I didn't expect it, and that was quite disappointing.
Any pollen that was once in the soil had already decomposed. It seemed pollen was not going to crack this case after all. Meanwhile, more conventional detective work was turning up valuable information. The victim was identified as Benson Wilson, a suspected drug dealer well known to the police.
It transpired that Ben Wilson was actually a con man, and he had been advertising that he could develop properties for investors. And there are a number of Chinese investors involved in this case, from both here in the UK and in Singapore and Kuching, who had invested money in the hope that they could make future gains from their investment here in the UK. Sadly, that wasn't the case, because Ben Wilson, being the con man he was, had taken their money but hadn't used it for what it was intended for. In fact, he'd used it for his own ends.
Benson Wilson's death attracted the attention of crime journalist Ronke Phillips.
So from what we know, the detail we know is the victim was employed by a gang because they had lots of money but that they needed laundered. We understand he was carrying out his own drug deals and pocketing the money. Now, the gang found out about that and they kidnapped him.
Paul's investigations revealed the gang kidnapped Wilson in the back of a van. They wanted to discuss the missing money. But as they drove across London, things went badly wrong.
So they tied him up, but they tied him up with his legs and arms behind him. He was a pretty big man, and this caused his lungs to collapse and he died.
They quickly changed vehicles to a hire car and fled London with Wilson's body.
They panicked, didn't really know England very well, and thought they were taking him to a dump in Wales. They actually ended up in Hertfordshire at a field.
It was here that they dumped Wilson's body, leaving tyre tracks as they drove across the field.
Detectives managed to establish that those tyre tracks came from a Rover 316 or a similar car, and after a lot of painstaking detective work, they found the car was actually a hire car, and coincidentally the car was due to be auctioned, so they literally got to that car just in time.
For Paul, there was another stroke of luck. The car had not been used by anyone else since the body was dumped. It meant there could still be trace evidence left by gang members inside the car, including Pollen. Paul immediately called Patricia Wiltshire.
I took the foot mats out and the pedals off. There were rubber ones, you could just pull them off. Now, anybody that had walked anywhere and driven would have brought the outside in. So whatever was represented outside would have been on the pedals and the foot mats. So I scrubbed them with an antiseptic surfactant to stop microbial activity, to stop the activity of bacteria and fungi. I scrubbed them with toothbrushes until I got sludges. And then I centrifuge and centrifuge and centrifuge until I ended up with pellets at the bottom of tubes. And I analysed those. Oh, wow. Lo and behold, the foot pedals and the foot mats just jumped out.
The results of Patricia's painstaking work were staggering, and this time revealed a wealth of pollen evidence.
It was wonderful because there was a profile of an old hedge and a field edge, an arable field edge. And I was able to describe them in detail.
Patricia now had a profile for the variety of pollens found on the mats and pedals of the hire car. Now she needed to show where this variety of pollens could have come from.
We had to start eliminating, because did this pollen come from somewhere else? So we had to go around different addresses and, oh, it couldn't have come from here, it couldn't have come from there. This, because it's not just one pollen type, it's the whole assemblage.
Paul's case was now resting on Patricia's pollen profile. He was hoping it would prove the suspects in the hire car were not only in the field, but at the very point where the body had been dumped.
The police said to me, would you like to see the place? I said, oh gosh, yes, I would. So they took me there.
We got to the gate and she said to me, don't take me to the scene, I will take you to the scene, which I thought was incredible.
I think there was oak and something else, but it wasn't this right assemblage, and there weren't the right plants at the field edge. So we went on a bit further.
We came along this first part of the hedgerow, just after this oak tree, and Pat's saying, I don't think this is the ditch.
The hedge was wrong. I was disappointed. Oh no, this isn't right. It's similar, but there's an awful lot that's missing, that's in the profile. Further.
After all this work, it now seemed the forensic team's initial skepticism was right. It would be impossible to catch criminals from pollen samples.
And then halfway up the field, I said, oh my gosh, this is the place.
And we got to this point and she said, I can tell you now, there is dogweed, nettle, white nettle. Pat pointed out to all the shrubbery around here and said, this is the exact point of where the body was. And she was totally right.
Patricia's pollen analysis proved that the car had been taken into the field and that the passengers had walked around the very spot where the body had been dumped.
The assemblage and the profile of pollen I got on my slides matched a specific place, because just a few yards that way it was different, just a few yards that way it was different. It was quite specific.
Further forensics found some of Wilson's blood in the car. When combined with the pollen, it was enough for detectives to arrest the gang and have them tried for kidnapping and murder.
Some people would look at this victim and say, look, come on, he was involved in very serious crimes, he was drug dealing. But as far as the detectives working on this case, everyone is an equal. They will put as much work into dealing with a drug dealer as they will with somebody who's considered an ordinary person. At the end, everybody deserves justice.
Patricia Wiltshire's work on this case was groundbreaking and gave rise to a whole new area of forensics.
I thought, well, it's been useful. That's all I thought. And put an evil gang of people away. As far as I knew, that was it. But I was asked to do another case, and then another case, and another case. And eventually, we set up a master's course in forensic archaeological science.
This was a first, and it was a eureka moment for me, really. I've been to many scenes of crimes, and many of them have been in remote locations. And I've wished that the trees and the bushes surrounding the crime scene could speak to me. And on this occasion, they did.
Fibres can associate people with people, it can associate people with places. It also has very high intelligence value. In other words, it can indicate where somebody's been or an object has been. And in some instances, it can actually give us timeframes for when things actually occurred.
August 2006, Cambridgeshire. An horrific three-car crash leaves a stockbroker, Alexander Palmer, dead and others seriously injured. Mr. Palmer was a 36-year-old father of two. He was returning from work in the city to his home in Suffolk when a red Vauxhall crossed the central reservation and struck his blue Audi. Mr. Palmer was declared dead at the scene. The collision was right on the patch of crime journalist Chris Summers.
The M11 in Cambridgeshire is a very popular route from London up to East Anglia. And on this day, there was a massive pile-up of cars. A Vauxhall Frontiera crossed the central reservation, struck an Audi coming in the other direction, and one person was killed from that car, and there was many other people injured.
Both occupants of the Frontiera, Anne Milton and Michael Wall, were left with serious injuries, but survived. They were later questioned by police investigating who was responsible for the crash.
When she was interviewed by police, Anne Milton explained that that day she was on her way to Norfolk to visit her partner in jail. She claimed that she'd been a passenger in the Frontiera when they suddenly lost control and went into the central reservation.
Detectives suspected Anne Milton herself was at the wheel, but had no evidence to back that up.
It became clear that Anne Milton had very good reasons to say that she wasn't the driver and Michael Wall was the driver, because it turned out that she'd been banned from driving. So if she was driving that day, she was driving while disqualified, which is a very serious offence. And she also had cocaine and methadone in her system. When the police were investigating this case, there was no CCTV cameras on that part of the motorway. There was no dash cam footage that could explain who was driving. Anne Milton was saying that she was not the driver. It was extremely difficult for the police to prove otherwise until the scientists came along.
Leading those scientists was expert witness Dr. Ray Palmer, a specialist in investigating road traffic accidents.
The police were suspicious of the female occupant's account of the events leading up to the collision. They had some information to suggest that, in fact, that she was the driver, and indeed that the male occupant was, in fact, the passenger. And what they needed us to do was to either corroborate that or refute it. So, in other words, was she or wasn't she the driver at the time of the collision?
But the common forensic tools, such as DNA, were of little use to Ray due to the violent nature of road traffic accidents.
It's a very dynamic situation. The car's often spinning, overturning, or occupants have been thrown about. So things like blood may be thrown about onto different surfaces, and it can be very confusing. It's not to say they're never useful, but very often they're not. And likewise, with simple fibre transfers to seats, and in situations where one or more of the occupants has use of the vehicle, it will not give you any time-specific information.
Ray, however, had one weapon in his arsenal of forensic tools that could give police the answers they needed.
Fibre-plastic fusions and plastic coating marks occur when a textile surface comes in contact with a plastic surface, when there's high energies and frictional forces generated, such as in a road traffic collision.
The force of impact in a car crash causes huge amounts of energy to be converted through friction into extremely high temperatures. Within a fraction of a second, fibres in the clothes of the vehicle's occupants melt and fuse with the plastic of the panels and pedals they impact with. The result, fibre and plastic fusion marks left on the car and on the clothing.
You can expect to find them when there's massive damage to the vehicle and an injury to the occupants. Fibre-plastic fusions and plastic coating marks are formed at the point of collision. They can, under certain circumstances, give us highly significant positional information about the occupants of a car at the time of the collision, since they're formed in a very, very split second. In order to demonstrate the type of force that's involved in creating a fibre-plastic fusion, we have a plastic panel here that's from a car, and we have this polyester cotton garment. So the intention is what we're going to do is put the garment over the top of the plastic panel, like so. We're going to ask Jack here to hit this combination as hard as he can with this rather large sledgehammer he has, and hopefully we should just about generate the amount of energy required to produce the marks. Yeah, success. You can see here on the screen that these fibres have completely melted and fused into the plastic of the panel. And there's sufficient intact material present that we would actually cut off and mount onto a microscope for further analysis.
If Ray and his team of forensic investigators could find plastic fusion marks like these inside the Frontera, then they could begin to work out who was driving.
If you don't know what you're looking for, they're easily overlooked. When we looked at the plastic panels on the passenger footwell, we found a fibre-plastic fusion mark which contained intact blue fibres.
Ray's next job was to work out whose clothes these fibres had come from, and Milton, who claimed to be the passenger, or Michael Wall.
We removed some of the intact ones and performed a standard fibre analysis in comparison with the fibres comprising the male occupant's socks. And the conclusion was that his socks had been in contact with with the panel, the passenger side footwell panel.
It now seemed Michael Wall was the passenger and not Anne Milton. To be certain, Ray began the same analysis of the driver's side footwell.
On the brake pedal cover of the Frontera, we found a mark, a brown plastic coating mark. And under further analysis, we found that this mark consisted of polyurethane, which matched the material on the female occupant's boots. But in addition, a closer examination of her left boot showed there was a plastic coating mark which matched the design and pattern of the brake pedal cover itself.
Fibres from Michael Wall's sock placed him in the passenger seat, while plastic coating marks from the brake pedal on Anne Milton's shoe puts her at the steering wheel and proved she was lying.
Putting the findings in that context, we were able to actually say that, yes, the female occupant was driving at the time of the collision.
Police charged Anne Milton with causing death by dangerous driving and driving while disqualified. She pleaded guilty and was jailed for 7.5 years.
If the forensic experts had not been able to find this fibre fusion evidence, there's no doubt that Anne Milton would have got away with it. She would have not been brought to trial. She certainly wouldn't have been convicted. And nobody would have known that she was responsible for this terrible crash.
For Ray and his team, cases like this provide more than just job satisfaction.
It's a satisfying feeling, yes. It principally shows the value of forensic science and how it can be useful to the criminal justice system. And above all, in tragic cases like this where someone's died, it's given closure to the family as well.